Hey guys, so today we're going to look at market equilibrium. Now that we've looked at demand and supply, there is a point where both of them will cross over and we call that the market equilibrium. So if, first of all, to note that if there's no interference in the market by the government or another agency, price will eventually settle at a level where quantity demanded, and that's what market equilibrium is, where our quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And it's called the market equilibrium. So when we talk about government interfering, the government can interfere by putting a levy or a tax on a particular good. It can also interfere if we look at the market for labour, so demand and supply for labour, that is workers. The government interference there is what's called the minimum wage. So there may be people who are willing to work for less than minimum wage who aren't getting jobs because the government have implemented a minimum wage. And I'll show you that now in a second. So look, if we look at a diagram here, so let's just put down our P and our Q, and we know that this is our demand curve and this is our supply curve. Our supply curve is upward sloping. Then our market equilibrium is this point here. We can call this E. And at that point, we have Q1, or we'll actually call it QE, and then we have PE. And what we can see here is at that point, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Now, I'm going to use this graph to show you what happens if we have a price higher or lower than PE. Okay, so let us just pretend now that we set a price that's a little bit higher than PE. So let's set a price at P1, and it's going to be a little bit higher. So let's say P1 is here. Okay, now if I look and I go the whole way across, where it hits my demand curve is right there. So this will be my QD, my quantity demanded at that price. And what happens is my quantity supplied at that price is much less. So remember, if we're thinking in terms of wages, this is exactly what happens with minimum wage, where the price is set maybe higher than where the equilibrium price is, and you have less demand for labour. So worker or companies don't want to actually employ labour because the price is too high, and then you have more people willing to supply your labour. So you have this big gap here. Okay, and that is that quantity demanded, QD, is less than quantity supplied. Okay, so what happens there is that if the prices on the market is above the equilibrium price, there would be a downward pressure on the price. Even if we were looking at some normal good here, if the price is too high and the demand is not there, and we see this the whole time with sales, where they have sales and they reduce the price just in order to get people to buy more of the good. So we can see here that if we reduce the price, it will start to increase demand. Now, it may start to decrease supply, but at least then a point will be reached where they may be equal. So we can see here quantity supplied will exceed quantity demanded, and producers will lower the price to get rid of surplus stock. And that's in terms of a normal good. When we look at minimum wage, yes, sometimes the government lowers minimum wage. It hasn't happened in a very long time. But if they were to lower minimum wage, what would happen is you would have companies demanding more labour, but the only thing is you would have some people who feel that their labour is worth P1, not PE, and therefore they may reduce their supply of labour. Okay, so now let's say we have a lower price. So this lower price is going to be P2, and I'm going to put it less than PE. So let's put it there, P2, and that's at this price here. Well, what we see is bring our line across, and when we hit that supply curve, bring it down, and that gives me QS. And if we keep going across, when we hit the demand curve and we bring it down, that gives me QD. Okay, so you can see there's a gap there between the two of them. That little curly bracket is just to show the gap. So what we have now is QD is greater than QS. And we'd expect that. So if you lower the price, you imagine if tomorrow morning iPhone brought out, or Apple brought out an iPhone, brand new iPhone, and they only charged €100 for it, you would have huge demand for it. If the price on the market is below the equilibrium price, there will be an upward pressure on the price. So what would happen is Apple wouldn't be able to deal with the demand for that product. So what they could do, they'd realise then that they could increase the price for it. Quantity demanded would exceed quantity supplied, and scarcity would exist, and prices would increase. So scarcity would exist because demand would be greater than supply. Now, unfortunately, sometimes what happens here is that if demand is greater than supply, you will have black economy activity or hidden economy activity. And we would have seen this an awful lot with tickets. Do you remember when you used to be able to buy tickets online for concerts, and then some people would buy them and sell them at a higher price at a later date? So there's a really good example where the quantity supplied was fixed. They could only sell as many tickets as the venue would hold, but some people would buy them, and in order to extort the fact that demand was much higher, they would charge a higher price for them. Okay, we call them ticket touts. So what happens here is, if you start to increase the price to PE, you have more people willing to supply, but you have less demand. And again, you'll eventually meet this point that's called the equilibrium point, which is where quantity supply is equal to quantity demand. Why do we always want to be at this point? Well, it's the most efficient point, because at that point there is no one who, like when we look at the last one, we had greater supply but less demand. And here there is a greater demand but less supply. Whereas at this point here, at this price and at this quantity, we have everybody that wants a particular good is supplied that particular good.